Well, let's go into this strange but most interesting field called mythology. Mythology in Plato takes an analogical form. All right, that's very strict, and so let me introduce it for you. First, a myth expresses in symbolic form the journey of the soul, while the hero represents its ideal. Now, of course, a myth to be a myth needs several interesting ingredients, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but primarily needs a figure that is divine or divine descent. The myth needs a setting, and it needs a drama. And it serves a great purpose because it's going to express in symbolic form the journey of the soul. Now, let's see what we can do with that. In the opening of Plato's Phaedo, there is a myth told, and the myth is of Theseus. Now, Theseus was the great hero who journeyed with 14 to the island of Crete, the Minoan Empire. And he went with the 14 because the 14 were to be sacrificed to the Minotaur, half man, half bull. And he went with them to break this ritual. Every 4 years they were doing this. And Theseus decided, therefore, it was necessary to seek out the Minotaur, slay the Minotaur, return with the 14, return home, and of course when he returned home, he became king. To get to the Minotaur, of course, he had to go through the labyrinth and seek out where it was, where the Minotaur was. To do that, of course, according to the myth, Adrian gave him a thread, which he then tied to an object and then descended down into the labyrinth, so he could work his way back, and a sword to slay the Minotaur. Now look here. Therefore we have Theseus, the hero, who accompanies the 14 to slay the Minotaur and thus save the 14 and himself. Now, Plato mentions this in the beginning of the dialogue, the Phaedo, to account for why Socrates wasn't put to death immediately after the sentencing. Now, some very interesting people come by who are Pythagoreans, and they want to know from Phaedo, who was one of the 14, who was present at the death scene of Socrates. And it turns out, therefore, that, good heavens, you know what? They mention who was present at the death of Socrates, and it turns out to be 14 people. But it's 14 plus Socrates. Oh, is that a coincidence? Socrates, therefore, explores the very nature of death. And he comes up with a most interesting and most essential theory of Platonic thought. And that is, true philosophy is nothing other than the study of and the practice of death and dying. That's the goal of philosophy. The study of death and the practice of dying. How do you practice dying? I guess if you fail in your practice, you may live. No. Now look here. So the first part of the dialogue, Socrates is going to explore what is meant by slaying death and practicing dying. Now, the people around Socrates, principally two people, Cebes and Simmias. After they hear this discussion, which goes up to about 69 in the Stephanus numbers, they object and they say, look, Socrates, the soul may survive death, but how do you know when it survives death that it has any power and intelligence? And so now Socrates has to explore what particular objection leads them to this position that they have. What position is that? That the idea that the soul upon death may simply be like smoke and dissipate with the first wind. And so we have then an exploration of Cebes' position and Simmias' position. Now, that's just in general. Now I'd like to go into this one issue. You see, there's only one person in the myth who goes down into the labyrinth and slays the Minotaur. The 14 don't know that Theseus has slayed the Minotaur. Only Theseus knows he slayed the Minotaur. Upon slaying the Minotaur, he returns, convinces the 14 that he in fact has slayed the Minotaur, and they journey back home, and he becomes king. Now, we have the same thing here, because I think I'll show you that Socrates' goal is slaying death. Slaying death, that's the goal. They have the fear of death. And that fear, therefore, must be specific. It must be a particular kind of fear. It must have some content. But now, what does he mean by slaying death? Well, he's got a great line. And what he says is that the slaying of death is really a purification for the philosopher. And the purification is nothing other than the separation of the soul from the body. Now, the idea of the soul, you must understand, right, is thought of as something that encompasses the entire body. Because the idea of soul in Greek thought is primarily vitality, the principle of life. Soul brings with it to the body a vitality and a life. And since the life extends throughout the entire body, therefore the task of the philosopher, if he can separate the soul from the body, means he has to be able to draw from all parts of the body, into a unity the soul. That is a practice. That is a yoga, as we call it today. That is a spiritual discipline.